The gym was alive with the sound of fists hitting punching bags, sneakers squeaking on the floor, and the sharp whistles of trainers guiding their students. Among all the noise and movement, there was one person who stood out the most: the black belt. Everyone in the gym knew him. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering his craft. His uniform was spotless, his black belt tied tight around his waist, and his muscles showed the strength of countless hours of training. People often gathered to watch him practice. His kicks were fast, his punches sharp, and his movements so smooth they looked almost like a dance. For many young students, he was a role model, someone they wanted to become one day. But along with admiration, there was also fear. The black belt had a reputation not just for his skill, but for his arrogance. He liked to remind others that he was the best, and sometimes he would tease those who were less skilled. His smile wasn't always friendly. It often carried a hint of pride, the kind that made people uncomfortable in the same gym. Moving quietly in the background was a man almost nobody noticed: the janitor. He wore simple clothes, usually faded from years of washing, and carried a mop or broom as he worked from one corner to another. While others were busy sparring, lifting weights, or chatting, he swept the floors, wiped down the mirrors, and emptied the trash. He was not a part of the action, at least. That's what everyone thought. Most people barely greeted him. To them, he was just the janitor. Someone who kept the gym clean so they could train without worry. But if anyone had taken a closer look, they might have noticed something unusual about him. The way he carried his body was steady and balanced, not clumsy like someone who had never trained. His back was straight, his movements calm, and his eyes sharp. When he bent to pick something up, or when he pushed the mop across the floor, there was a kind of control in his muscles that didn't match the life of an ordinary worker. Yet no one paid attention. People often see only what they expect, and in their eyes, a janitor could never be more than a man with a mop. The black belt noticed him too, but not with respect. To him, the janitor was invisible, someone beneath his world. On some days, when the black belt was in an especially boastful mood, he would even make small jokes about the janitor to his friends. They would laugh quietly, and the janitor would continue working, never responding. His silence was not weakness, it was patience. One afternoon, the gym was more crowded than usual. A group of new students had joined, and the black belt was eager to show off. He moved around the mat with energy, demonstrating his kicks and strikes, making the crowd cheer with each powerful move. His confidence grew with every clap and cheer, and he felt unstoppable. That was when his eyes landed on the janitor again. The janitor was cleaning the far corner, his mop gliding across the shiny floor. He didn't seem interested in the show happening in the center. That small detail irritated the black belt. How could someone not watch him, not admire his skill, especially someone like a janitor? Pride mixed with arrogance, and a daring idea formed in his mind. He called out across the gym, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, old man, you've been standing there with that mop all day. Why don't you come here and test yourself? Let's have some fun." At first, the crowd thought he was joking. Some laughed, some looked at the janitor with curiosity, and others whispered to each other, surprised at the sudden challenge. The janitor looked up slowly. His eyes met the black belt's, calm and steady. For a moment, the gym seemed quieter, as if everyone was waiting to see how he would respond. But the janitor didn't say anything. He gave a small smile, almost like he had heard this sort of thing before, and went back to cleaning the floor. The black belt's friends laughed, thinking the janitor was too afraid to answer. The black belt smirked, enjoying the moment of power. To him, it was proof that he was stronger, more important, more respected. What he didn't realize was that this was just the beginning. That simple, careless challenge would soon lead to something nobody in the gym could have predicted. Behind the janitor's quiet smile lay a story, a hidden skill, and a strength that would turn the entire gym upside down. For now, though, all people saw was a setup, a proud black belt, eager to prove himself, and a silent janitor carrying secrets no one cared to notice. The stage was ready, and destiny was waiting for the moment when pride and patience would collide in the most unexpected way. Asterisk the janitor was not the kind of man who drew attention. He wore plain, loose-fitting clothes that looked the same every day: dark pants, a simple shirt, and old sneakers that had seen better years. His hair carried the strands of gray that hinted at age, and his hands were rough from years of work. To anyone passing by, he was just another quiet worker doing an ordinary job. But if someone had looked closer, really looked, they might have noticed something different about him. The way he carried the mop was not clumsy. 'Twas precise, like each movement was controlled. He didn't drag his feet the way tired workers sometimes did. Instead, his steps were steady, balanced, almost graceful. His back was straight, and his eyes, though calm, carried a depth that spoke of experience and quiet strength. For years, he had worked in that gym. Most of the regulars never even asked his name. To them, he was simply the janitor. He came in early, cleaned before training sessions began, stayed through the busiest hours, and was often the last to leave. He wiped down the mats after sweaty sparring matches, polished the mirrors clouded with fingerprints, and collected the water bottles left behind. Nobody questioned him. Nobody thanked him beyond a quick nod, and that was fine by him. He preferred to remain invisible. What nobody knew was that this man had once lived a very different life. Long before he wore the label of janitor, he had worn another title, a title earned through blood, sweat, and endless discipline. He had once been a fighter. Not the kind who bragged or showed off, but the kind who carried his skill like a hidden blade, sharp, silent, and dangerous only when necessary. Life, however, has a way of humbling even the strongest. Circumstances had pulled him away from the ring and into a quieter world. Now he fought different battles. Bills, loneliness, and the weight of memories he preferred not to revisit. Yet, his body still remembered. Every muscle carried the memory of strikes thrown, blocks mastered, and years of training that had carved discipline into his very bones. Even though he no longer sparred, the instinct of a fighter never left him. It was there in his posture, in the way his eyes measured space, and in the way he seemed to know the rhythm of the room without even looking. The students at the gym never saw this. To them, he was background noise. But sometimes, when the gym was nearly empty, a few might catch him pausing with his mop, standing silently as if lost in thought. What they didn't realize was that in those quiet moments, his mind returned to old days when he was the one being watched. The one standing on the mat, hearing the roar of a crowd instead of the faint squeak of a mop bucket. He had walked away from that life, but a part of it still lived inside him. The black belt, however, had no idea. He saw only what everyone else saw, an aging janitor who posed no threat. The very idea that this man could have once been a master of the same art he boasted about never even crossed his mind. To him, the janitor was someone beneath him, someone to mock, someone to make an example of. But the janitor was not bitter. Despite the lack of respect, he carried himself with quiet pride. He did his job carefully, with the same discipline he once applied to training. For him, cleaning the gym was not meaningless work, it was a service. The floor had to be spotless so others could practice safely. The mirrors had to shine so students could see their movements clearly. The mats had to be fresh so no one slipped. Every task he performed, he treated as important, because discipline, once learned, never leaves. Some of the older trainers, those who had sharp eyes, sometimes wondered about him. They noticed the way his shoulders rolled when he lifted heavy buckets, how his breathing stayed steady even after hours of physical labor, and how his hands never trembled, even with age. A few times they thought about asking if he had ever trained in martial arts himself, but the janitor never offered and they never pressed. That day, when the black belt called him out, the janitor's calm eyes met his with no fear. He had lived long enough, fought enough battles inside and outside the ring that no taunt could break his patience. He gave a small, knowing smile, then lowered his gaze and returned to cleaning. But deep inside, something stirred. It had been years since anyone had challenged him, years since he had felt the fire of combat even flicker. He did not want to fight, but the arrogance of the young martial artist had planted a seed. The gym-goers laughed at the scene, but they had no idea they were witnessing the beginning of something unforgettable. Behind that mop, behind those quiet eyes, was a man with a story. A man who had once stood exactly where the black belt stood, now confident, admired, and unstoppable. The only difference was that the janitor had learned something the black belt had not yet discovered. True. Strength is not shown through pride, but through humility. And soon, everyone in that gym would learn it too. The gym was buzzing that afternoon. New students were milling around, trainers barked instructions, and the black belt was in his element. He loved when the gym was full. A big crowd meant a bigger stage, and he adored being at the center of attention. Each strike he threw on the mat was faster than the last, each kick sharper, each move louder, as if he wanted every corner of the gym to feel his presence. People clapped when he landed a powerful spinning kick against a practice pad. He looked around, saw the admiration in their eyes, and smiled with the kind of pride that demanded more. That's when he saw the janitor again. The man was in the far corner, wiping down a bench with an old rag. He wasn't looking at the black belt. He wasn't clapping or cheering. He wasn't impressed. And somehow, that bothered the martial artist more than anything else. How could this old janitor ignore him? How could he stand there, so calm, when everyone else looked at him with awe? The black belt's smirk widened. A thought struck him, one that was half arrogance and half amusement. If the janitor wouldn't give him respect, then he would force it out of him. He decided to make the man part of his show. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Hey, old man," he called out. "You've been hiding behind that mop long enough. How about you step up here and give us a fight? Just for fun." The crowd froze for a moment. Then laughter rippled through the gym. Some of the younger students chuckled nervously. Others whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the black belt and the janitor. A few looked uncomfortable, unsure if this was a joke or cruelty. The janitor paused mid-wipe. Slowly, he turned his head toward the black belt. His face showed no anger, no irritation, just calm. His eyes locked onto the martial artist for a brief second, steady and unreadable, before he returned to his work. He gave no answer. The black belt didn't like that. He stepped closer to the edge of the mat, pointing a finger at the janitor. "What's the matter? Afraid? Don't worry, I'll go easy on you." His friends laughed at the comment, and some of the students joined in, though uneasily. The janitor straightened up this time, resting the rag on the bench. He looked at the crowd, then back at the black belt. For a long moment, he said nothing. Silence stretched across the gym until you could almost hear hearts beating. Then, in a calm voice, he finally spoke. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to work." Some chuckled at his words, but others felt the weight in his tone. It wasn't weakness, it was choice. The black belt, however, only heard rejection. And rejection in front of an audience was something he couldn't accept. He pushed harder. "Come on, just one round. No one will blame you for losing. After all, You're just the janitor." That word just hung heavy in the air. It carried disrespect, and the crowd felt it. A few people shifted uncomfortably, sensing the arrogance, cutting deeper than before. The janitor's jaw tightened, though his face remained calm. He had heard that word too many times in his life, and he had learned to let it pass. But there was something different about this moment. Something in the air told him this challenge wasn't just about pride, was about respect. He looked around at the young students. Their eyes were wide, some with laughter, some with doubt, and some with curiosity. He saw in them the same faces he had once trained alongside in another lifetime. And in that moment, he realized that if he stayed silent, the wrong lesson would take root, that arrogance was strength, and humility was weakness. That was not the truth he had lived, and it was not the truth he wanted these students to believe. So, with a slow breath, he nodded once. "If it is only for fun," he said softly, "then I'll accept." The room erupted. Some gasped, some cheered, some shook their heads in disbelief. The black belt's grin widened into a full smile. He had gotten what he wanted, a spectacle. He hopped onto the mat, bouncing on his feet like a champion about to perform. "This'll be quick," he told the crowd. The janitor, however, didn't rush. He folded the rag neatly, placed it on the bench, and walked calmly toward the mat. His steps were steady, his breathing slow. He didn't look like a man about to fight. He looked like a man taking a quiet walk in the park. And yet, there was something about him now that people hadn't noticed before. The way he held his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the space. The silence around him carried an unshakable weight. He stepped onto the mat, his old sneakers squeaking softly. The crowd laughed at the Saitan aging janitor in worn-out shoes, facing a trained black belt in full uniform. It looked ridiculous, uneven, impossible. But the janitor didn't seem bothered. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes fixed on the black belt. There was no fear in him, no excitement, just calm, and that calmness unsettled more than a few people in the room. They couldn't explain it, but they could feel its sense that maybe, just maybe, this fight wouldn't go the way they expected. What none of them knew was that the moment the janitor stepped onto that mat, something long asleep inside him had awakened. The fire of a fighter, buried beneath years of silence, had flickered to life once again. The challenge was set. The crowd leaned forward. The black belt bounced with pride, and the janitor waited, still as stone. What happened next would change the way everyone in that gym looked at strength, respect, and the man they had all called just the janitor. The janitor stood on the mat, his posture straight but unassuming. His hands rested loosely at his sides, not clenched in fists, not raised in defense. To the crowd, it looked like a man out of place, like a worker dragged into a game he had no business playing. To the black belt, it looked like weakness. To the janitor himself, fit felt like a crossroads. For a brief moment, time slowed for him. The noises of the gym, the whispers, the chuckles, the claps of encouragement for the black belt faded. Into the background, inside his chest, two voices clashed. One was calm and familiar, whispering that he should walk away, return to his mop and rag, and let the boy have his pride. He had nothing to prove. He had lived his battles, endured his scars, and carried wisdom that arrogance could not touch. Fighting now would be meaningless. But then there was another voice, older and heavier. It wasn't pride, not anger, but something closer to duty. He looked at the students, young faces glowing with admiration for the black belt's arrogance. What would they learn if he refused? That mocking someone weaker was acceptable. That respect had to be earned through humiliation. That strength was only about flashy moves and loud declarations. He remembered his own teacher, years ago. A man who had drilled into him one lesson above all. A true warrior fights only when he must. But when the moment comes, he fights not for himself, but for others. The janitor drew a long breath. His hesitation was not fear, was the weight of choice. He had left that life behind. He had promised himself never to step back into combat. Yet here he was, facing a boy drunk on arrogance, with a crowd that desperately needed to see humility win over pride. The black belt mistook that silence for cowardice. He bounced lightly on his feet, throwing a few quick punches in the air, making the crowd cheer. "What's the matter, old man? Changed your mind already?" he taunted. His voice carried across the gym, bold and sharp, slicing into the janitor's quiet moment. Some laughed, some pitied the janitor. A few older trainers shook their heads, sensing that this was spiraling beyond a simple show. The janitor's eyes flicked up again, studied the young martial artist, his stance wide, his muscles tensed, his grin cocky and careless. He saw a fighter who had trained his body but not his heart. The janitor's gaze softened, almost like a father watching a reckless son who hadn't yet learned the cost of his own pride. He almost shook his head, almost turned away. But then, in the corner of his vision, he saw a boy no older than 15. The boy's eyes were shining with admiration for the black belt, his small hands clenched in fists as if he wanted to be just like him. That image struck the janitor, harder than any punch could. He knew, in that moment, that walking away would teach the wrong lesson. He exhaled slowly, letting go of his hesitation. "All right," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than volume. "If you insist." The gym seemed to inhale as one. The decision was made. The fight was going to happen. Still, the janitor did not rush. He slid his hands behind his back, stretching his fingers gently, loosening his shoulders. The movements were subtle, but anyone with sharp eyes would recognize them, not the motions of a man preparing to embarrass himself, but of a fighter quietly waking up old instincts. The black belt didn't notice. He was too busy grinning, bowing theatrically to the crowd, and shouting, "Don't blink, everyone, this will be over before it starts." The audience laughed and clapped, some cheering his name, some murmuring doubts, but all of them glued to the mat. The janitor, meanwhile, closed his eyes for the briefest second. Memories washed over him. The echo of past fights, the roar of long-forgotten crowds, the sting of sweat in his eyes. He hadn't stood on a mat like this in years. But now that he had chosen, the fighter inside him was awake again. He opened his eyes, and they were not the same calm eyes from before. They carried a quiet intensity now, like the surface of a lake hiding a deep current. The crowd didn't notice, but the few older trainers did. One leaned to another and whispered, "Watch closely. This isn't what it looks like." The hesitation was gone. The choice had been made. The janitor had agreed, not because he wanted glory, but because a lesson needed to be taught. He adjusted his stance, only slightly. To most, it looked like he was simply shifting his weight. But the seasoned trainers saw it: balance, control, readiness. His feet were light but firm, his shoulders loose but centered. He was ready in his own quiet way. The black belt raised his fists high, bouncing, showboating, while the janitor remained still, a calm shadow on the mat. To the untrained eye, it looked like an uneven fight. One young, strong, and eager, versus one old, ordinary, and tired. But beneath the surface, the true story was waiting to unfold. And as the crowd leaned forward, laughter still hanging in the cop, laughter still hanging in the air, no one could guess how completely their world was about to flip. The air in the gym grew heavy. Every eye was locked on the mat where the black belt bounced on his toes, fists raised, a grin spread wide across his face. The janitor, in contrast, stood still, calm, silent, his arms loose at his sides as if he had wandered into the wrong place. To most of the crowd, it looked like a fight between fire and stone, and they were sure the fire would win. The black belt threw the first move. A quick jab, fast and sharp, aimed straight at the janitor's face. The crowd gasped, already expecting the old man to stumble. But the janitor didn't stumble. He didn't even flinch. With the smallest tilt of his head, the punch slid past him like air. His body didn't jerk, didn't panic. It was as if he had known exactly where the strike would land before it was even thrown. The crowd blinked, confused. Some laughed nervously, brushing it off as luck. The black belt frowned, but quickly covered it with a smirk. He threw another punch, harder this time. Then another. Left, right, left each. One fast, trained, and precise. But each time, the janitor moved just enough to avoid them. A slight step back, a turn of his shoulder. A lean that looked effortless. Not once did his hands rise to block. The gym grew quieter. Whispers replaced laughter. The crowd expected flailing, panic, or at least an attempt to defend. But the janitor looked almost bored. He moved like water around rocks, flowing smoothly past every strike. His calm eyes never left the black belt's face, and that calmness was beginning to unsettle him. Anger flashed across the young fighter's eyes. He decided to up the pace. With a loud shout, he lunged forward, his leg snapping up in a high kick aimed at the janitor's head. It was the kind of move that usually made crowds cheer, but the cheer never came. The janitor's foot slid half an inch across the mat. That was all. The kick whooshed past, missing him entirely. And before the black belt could reset, the janitor stepped aside, leaving the fighter to stumble a little as his own momentum betrayed. Came! Gasps filled the gym. The janitor still hadn't raised his hands. Still hadn't struck back. He simply stood there, letting the younger man waste his energy. His breathing was steady, while the black belt's chest was already rising and falling with effort. The black belt's grin faltered. He had expected an easy victory, but instead, his strikes seemed to vanish into the air. His pride wouldn't let him stop, though. He launched into a furious combination, punches, kicks, spins, each one faster and harder than the last. His body was a storm, wild and relentless, and the janitor was the calm center of that storm. His feet glided across the mat, smooth and controlled. He leaned just enough to let a fist pass, stepped aside just enough to let a kick fly harmlessly by. Not once did he break rhythm. Not once did he lose balance. Every movement was efficient, economical, like a man who had done this thousands of times before. The crowd was no longer laughing. Their eyes widened, their mouths hung open. Some whispered to each other, "Did you see that? He's not even trying." Others simply stared, caught between disbelief and awe. One of the older trainers muttered under his breath, "This isn't luck. That man knows exactly what he's doing. It's a black belt." Frustrated, tried one more time. He rushed in with a powerful strike meant to end it, a straight punch aimed at the janitor's chest with all the strength he could muster. But just as his fist came forward, the janitor finally moved with purpose. He stepped to the side, faster than anyone expected. His hand, for the first time, lifted not to strike, but to guide. With a simple tap against the black belt's wrist, he redirected the punch past his body, and with a gentle push on the fighter's shoulder, he sent him stumbling forward. It wasn't forceful, it wasn't brutal. It was controlled, precise, almost effortless. The young man stumbled across the mat, barely catching himself before falling. The crowd erupted, not with laughter this time, but with shocked cries. The janitor didn't follow up. He didn't attack. He simply stood there again, his arms at his sides, his eyes calm. His message was clear. "I could have hurt you, but I didn't need to." The black belt's face turned red, part anger, part embarrassment. He clenched his fists tighter, his pride burning hotter than ever. He had expected a weak old man to crumble. Instead, he was the one being toyed with. The janitor's hesitation had been replaced with something else, now a quiet control that radiated across the room. The students watched with new eyes. The boy who had admired the black belt earlier now stared at the janitor with awe. The lesson was already beginning to sink in. Strength was not about noise or arrogance. Strength was silent, disciplined, and unshakable. But the fight was not over. The black belt refused to give in. He would not let the crowd remember him as the fighter who was humiliated by a janitor. He gritted his teeth, adjusted his stance, and prepared to attack again. The janitor took a deep breath, his expression unchanged. He had spent the first few minutes showing patience, letting the boy burn through his pride. But now, the time was coming when patience would give way to precision. The first moves had been made. The crowd had seen the balance shift. And though the fight had only just begun, everyone in the gym knew they were watching something far greater than a casual sparring match. They were witnessing a story unfold, one that would echo in their minds long after the mats had been rolled up and the lights turned off. The black belt's breathing was heavier now, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Sweat slid down his forehead, dripping onto the mat. He had unleashed nearly every strike he knew: jabs, kicks, spinning back fists. Even the dramatic moves he saved for demonstrations. And yet, the janitor still stood untouched. To the crowd, it no longer looked like a fight. It looked like a dance where only one partner knew the steps. The black belt flailed with energy, while the janitor glided around him with quiet grace. The young fighter's pride had carried him this far. But pride alone was beginning to crumble. The janitor, meanwhile, had not once struck back. He had only avoided, redirected, and allowed the black belt to exhaust himself. But now, the moment was shifting. The patience that had held him steady was turning into something else's subtle readiness. Like a storm quietly forming on the horizon. The black belt wiped his face with the back of his glove and shouted to the crowd, "He's just lucky." His words cracked with frustration, though he tried to hide it with a smirk. One good hit, and it's over. But deep inside, doubt had already entered his mind. His strikes weren't landing. His speed wasn't enough. And worst of all, every time he missed. The janitor's calm eyes reminded him of something terrifying. The old man wasn't struggling. He was waiting. The black belt lunged again, aiming a kick at the janitor's ribs. This time, the janitor didn't simply step aside. His hand moved swiftly, catching the younger man's ankle in midair. Gasps erupted from the crowd. In one smooth motion, the janitor twisted just enough not to break, not to harm, but to throw the black belt off balance. The young fighter landed awkwardly on one foot. Stumbling to the mat, the room fell silent. The janitor released him immediately, stepping back. His stance remained loose, non-threatening, but the message was crystal clear. I control this fight now. The black belt scrambled up, his pride burning hotter than ever. He rushed forward with a furious punch, throwing all his weight into it. But the janitor's body turned like a shadow, his arm slipping past the strike. And in that instant, for the first time, the janitor countered. It was not a brutal strike. It was not loud. It was a single, precise movement, a palm strike to the black belt's chest. Controlled, firm, and perfectly timed. The sound echoed across the gym like a clap of thunder. The black belt staggered backward several steps, shock written across his face. The crowd exploded in gasps and shouts. Nobody had expected the janitor to attack, and certainly not with such devastating precision. The black belt steadied himself, but his grin was gone now. His eyes darted nervously as he realized the truth. This wasn't luck. This wasn't an accident. The janitor knew exactly what he was doing, and he had been holding back all along. The young fighter launched another series of attacks, desperate to reclaim control. But now, the janitor began to answer each strike. Not just avoiding, but redirecting. A fist came. He parried it with a flick of his wrist. A kick swung high. He guided it harmlessly away with his forearm. Each counter was minimal, but powerful, making the black belt look clumsy and wild. And then came the moment that silenced everyone. The black belt spun for a back kick. His strongest move, the one that usually brought cheers. But before his foot could even land, the janitor stepped into his space, sweeping his leg with flawless timing. The black belt's body lifted slightly off the mat before crashing down onto his back. The gym erupted. Some shouted in disbelief. Some clapped. Some simply covered their mouths. The mighty black belt, the arrogant fighter everyone had admired, was on the ground. And the janitor, the man they had ignored, the man they had laughed at, stood over him, calm as ever. But the janitor didn't gloat. He didn't even look down at his opponent. He simply stepped back, giving him space to rise. His message was not about humiliation. It was about teaching. The black belt rose slowly, his pride shattered. His eyes flicked to the crowd, then back. To the janitor. For the first time, there was fear in his gaze. Not fear of pain, but fear of the truth. He had misjudged this man. He had mocked someone far greater than himself. The janitor took a slow breath, his voice low but steady. "Strength is not noise," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Strength is control." Those words struck harder than any punch. The crowd fell silent again, letting the lessons sink deep. The trainers exchanged knowing looks. Some of them had suspected the janitor's past, but now they were certain. His movements were not of a beginner. They were the marks of a man who had once lived in the world of true warriors. The black belt tried once more, but it was no use. His strikes lacked precision now, fueled only by desperation. The janitor countered each one with ease, his movements flowing like a master who had nothing left to prove. He didn't strike to hurt, he struck to control. Each movement whispered the truth. "I am not here to destroy you. I am here to teach you." By the time the black belt dropped his guard, chest heaving, sweat dripping, and pride crumbling, the crowd already knew the outcome. The turning point had passed. The janitor was not just holding his own, he had revealed himself as the true master on the mat. The silence in the gym was no longer disbelief. It was respect, and for the first time, even the black belt understood. This fight was never about victory or defeat. It was about humility, patience, and the truth hidden in plain sight. The black belt stood panting, his shoulders rising and falling like a man who had run a marathon. His arms hung heavy, his strikes slower now, while sweat poured down his face in thick drops. Across from him, the janitor stood as calm as ever, breathing steady, shoulders relaxed, eyes sharp but peaceful. He looked less like a man in the middle of a fight and more like a teacher, waiting patiently for a student to learn his lesson. The silence in the gym was deep now. Gone was the laughter. Gone were the whispers of amusement. Every single person stood frozen, their eyes locked on the mat, their hearts racing as if they were the ones fighting. For the first time, the crowd began to see the truth. At the beginning, they had all laughed with the black belt. They had smirked when he called out the janitor. They had chuckled when the old man picked up his mop and smiled faintly instead of answering. They had thought it was a joke, a silly distraction, a chance to see their hero humiliate someone who didn't belong in the world of fighters. But now they stared at the janitor like he was someone else entirely. Whispers started in the corners. "Did you see that sweep? That's not luck. No ordinary man moves like that. He's trained before he has to have." The younger students looked the most stunned. Many of them had spent months, even years, training under the black belt, copying his movements, admiring his skill. They had dreamed of fighting like him one day. And yet, in just a few moments, their idol had been undone by the man they had ignored every day. The janitor had done it without arrogance, without flashy moves, and without breaking a sweat. One boy, no older than 15, whispered to his friend, "He's not just a janitor. He's a master." The black belt's friends, the ones who had laughed the loudest at his jokes earlier, were now quiet, their smiles gone. Some of them looked away, ashamed. Others stared in disbelief, unable to process what was happening. It was as if the world had flipped upside down and the rules they thought they understood no longer applied. The older trainers were the calmest, but their eyes carried something the younger ones did not recognize: respect. They had seen men like this before, fighters who carried their strength in silence, who needed no stage, no applause, no recognition. The janitor's movements spoke of experience far deeper than the black belts. He had the kind of control that only came from years, even decades, of discipline. The black belt, still gasping, tried to force a grin. "He just got lucky," he muttered, his words shaky. But the crowd didn't believe him anymore. They had seen too much. The janitor remained silent. He didn't need to boast. His silence was heavier than any words. It pressed down on the gym, making the young fighter's excuses sound hollow. Then came the moment that burned itself into the memory of everyone present. The black belt, desperate to save face, charged once more. His fists swung wildly, his body trembling with effort. But before his punch could land, the janitor stepped into his space, pivoted slightly, and placed a gentle hand on the young man's chest. With one controlled push, the black belt stumbled backward and fell to his knees. The sound of his body hitting the mat echoed like a drumbeat. The crowd gasped. But no one laughed this time. Instead, they stared in silence, their hearts pounding. They had just witnessed something rare. Not the humiliation of a fighter, but the revelation of true mastery. The janitor didn't follow up. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't even look at the black belt on the ground. Instead, he turned his eyes toward the crowd. For the first time, his voice carried across the gym. "Respect is not given by mocking others," he said simply. "It is earned by how you carry yourself both in victory and in defeat." The words landed heavier than the push. The crowd felt it in their chests. Some looked down at the floor, embarrassed for how they had laughed earlier. Others nodded, slowly, their admiration for the janitor growing with each passing second. The younger students' eyes shone differently now. They no longer looked at the black belt as their hero. Their gaze had shifted to the man they once ignored, the one who cleaned their floors and picked up after them. They realized that real strength wasn't in flashy moves or loud voices, it was in calmness, patience, and control. The gym erupted not in cheers, but in applause. Slow, hesitant claps at first, then louder, stronger, until the whole room was filled with the sound. The applause wasn't for a fight. It was for a truth revealed. The black belt lowered his head, unable to meet their eyes. His pride was broken, but something deeper stirred within him. Humility, painful but necessary, was beginning to take root. He realized now that he had been blind, that he had mocked a man far greater than himself. The janitor gave a small bow, not for glory, but out of habit, out of respect. Then, without another word, he stepped off the mat, walking back toward the corner where his mop and rag still waited. He picked them up as if nothing had happened, returning to his work while the crowd remained in stunned silence. For a long while, nobody moved. They just watched him, their eyes filled with a new kind of respect. Some whispered softly, others stood quietly. But all of them carried the same thought in their minds. They had underestimated him. They had judged by appearance and missed the truth. That day, the janitor stopped being invisible. He became a living reminder that greatness often hides in the most ordinary places. And though the fight had ended, its memory would live in each person who saw it, changing how they looked at others and themselves forever. The gym was still echoing with the sound of clapping hands when the janitor picked up his mop again. The sight felt almost unreal. A moment ago, he had been on the mat, moving with precision and control that none of them could understand. He had floored the fighter they all admired. He had stunned every eye in the room, and now he was simply pushing a mop across the floor, silent, humble, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. That silence carried more weight than any victory celebration could have. It unsettled people, but it also humbled them. The younger students looked at him with wide eyes, still trying to make sense of it. How could someone so great return so easily to something so ordinary? The older trainers, however, understood. They saw wisdom in that act. They recognized the choice. The janitor was teaching them even now. Without words, that strength doesn't need to demand attention. Real power does not scream. It whispers. The black belt remained on the mat, kneeling with his head bowed. His chest heaved, not just from exhaustion, but from shame. He had entered the fight to humiliate someone he thought beneath him, but he had been the one humbled instead. The crowd's applause hadn't been for him, it had been for the janitor. The realization burned, but beneath the sting was something deeper, something more important: understanding. Slowly, he lifted his head and looked at the man pushing the mop. The janitor didn't look back, didn't seek acknowledgement. He simply worked, as he always did. And that, more than the fight itself, broke something inside the black belt. He stood, walked across the mat, and with shaky steps approached the janitor. The gym fell silent again. Watching when he reached him, the black belt stopped. For the first time in his life, he felt small in front of another man. He bowed his head low, a gesture of respect he had rarely given anyone. His voice trembled as he spoke. I'm sorry, I was wrong." The janitor paused, leaning lightly on the mop handle. He turned his head, his calm eyes meeting the young man's. Then, with the faintest smile, he shook his head. "You don't owe me an apology," he said softly. "You owe it to yourself. Learn from this. Strength is not for mocking others. It is for protecting, for guiding, for building respect. Remember that, and you will become more than a fighter. You will become a man." The black belt swallowed hard. Those words pierced deeper than any strike had. He nodded, his eyes wet with the sting of humility. For the first time, he understood that martial arts was more than flashy moves and recognition. It was discipline, humility, and service, things the janitor embodied with every step, every breath. The younger students looked on, their admiration shifting fully now. They no longer dreamed of being like the black belt. They dreamed of being like the man who had shown that true strength could exist in silence, that greatness could hide behind simple clothes and a mop bucket. They whispered among themselves, not with laughter this time, but with awe. "He's the real master." The trainers exchanged quiet nods. Some had suspected the janitor's past, but now it was clear. He was more than a worker. He was a man who had walked the path of a warrior long before any of them. He had nothing to prove, nothing to boast about, only lessons to share. The janitor, however, didn't linger on their stares. He finished wiping down the bench, then carried the mop back to the corner where it belonged. He moved with the same calm as before, as if he hadn't just stunned an entire gym. To him, the fight was already over, not just on the mat, but in the minds of those who had watched. He had shown them what they needed to see. As he left that night, the gym was still, buzzing. Students replayed every moment in their heads. Trainers muttered to each other about hidden legends, and the black belt sat quietly, lost in thought. But one thing was certain. None of them would ever forget what they had witnessed. The lesson lingered long after the janitor's footsteps faded. Never judge a person by their appearance. Never underestimate quiet strength. And never forget that humility is the greatest mark of power. The black belt would carry that lesson for the rest of his life. So would the students who had once laughed. And though the janitor would return, the next day in the same plain clothes, with the same mop and rag, none of them would ever see him the same way again. To them, he was no longer just a janitor. He was the reminder that true greatness often hides where you least expect it. And that lesson taught without pride, without shouting, without even asking for recognitions, touched everyone more deeply than the fight itself.